In the heart of the Egyptian desert, where the sand stretches endlessly beneath an unforgiving sun, lies a tomb lost to history. Pharaoh Merenra, once a mighty ruler whose name echoed through the halls of power, had vanished from the record centuries ago. His tomb, hidden deep in the desert, was a place whispered about by locals in hushed tones. Ancient legends spoke of a curse, one that promised death to anyone foolish enough to disturb his eternal rest. But those were just stories, weren't they? Dr. Jane Carter, a renowned archaeologist, had always dismissed such superstitions. Obsessed with uncovering the secrets of Egypt's past, she had spent years studying ancient texts, scouring forgotten scrolls, and piecing together fragments of information. When she finally uncovered a map, an ancient artifact that could lead to Merenra's tomb, she was determined to find it. Along with her team, she ventured into the desert, blind to the ominous warnings that the locals had given her. The team consisted of Dr. Samuel Miller, her trusted colleague, and two younger assistants, Ethan, a skeptic with a passion for adventure, and Maya, who was more cautious and superstitious. Maya had heard the stories, the rumors that Merenra had once been so powerful, he made a pact with dark forces, ensuring his reign would last forever. But she kept her fears to herself, not wanting to seem weak in front of the others. As they journeyed across the scorching sands, the oppressive heat seemed to press down on them, making every step a struggle. The wind howled relentlessly, whispering ancient secrets as it swirled around their faces, carrying with it a faint, almost imperceptible scent of death. Ethan laughed it off, joking that the desert was just playing tricks on them. But Maya couldn't shake the sense of foreboding that seemed to grow with each passing mile. After days of relentless travel, the team arrived at their destination, a jagged cliffside that concealed the entrance to the tomb. The discovery was almost too easy, as though the tomb had been waiting for them. A stone archway stood half buried in the sand, its walls etched with ancient hieroglyphs, some faded, others still glowing faintly with an eerie light. Above the arch, the inscription read, "He who disturbs this tomb shall awaken the wrath of Merenra." Ethan scoffed, shaking his head. "It's just a warning, nothing to be afraid of." But Maya's heart raced as she stared at the warning, feeling a cold shiver run down her spine. She tried to dismiss it as superstition, but the words lingered in her mind like a haunting melody. "I don't think we should go in," she said quietly, but her voice barely carried over the wind. Dr. Carter, however, was already walking toward the entrance, her mind consumed by the discovery. "This is it. We found it. We're making history," she said with an almost manic gleam in her eyes. The team entered the tomb, their footsteps echoing off the stone walls. The air was thick with the scent of age and decay, and as they ventured deeper, the temperature plummeted. They could hear a faint humming sound, like a low vibration coming from the very heart of the tomb. It was unnerving, unnatural. Maya felt the weight of the silence press against her chest, but she kept her fears to herself. The deeper they went, the more the tomb seemed to twist and contort. The corridors narrowed, and the walls seemed to close in around them. Ancient murals lined the walls, depicting Merenra's reign, his victories, his wealth, and most disturbingly, his pact with shadowy, otherworldly figures. The further they ventured, the more the air seemed to hum with a sinister energy. They reached a large chamber, and in the center lay the sarcophagus of Pharaoh Merenra. The sight was awe-inspiring, the craftsmanship beyond anything they had ever seen. The tomb was lined with jewels, gold, and offerings meant for the afterlife. But there was something wrong, something dark about the scene. The air was heavy, as if the tomb itself was alive and watching them. Dr. Carter approached the sarcophagus eagerly, brushing aside her unease. "This is it," she whispered, her voice filled with reverence. "The final resting place of Merenra. This is where history begins." But just as she reached out to touch the sarcophagus, the temperature dropped sharply. The walls began to vibrate violently, and a low, guttural growl filled the chamber. The floor trembled beneath their feet, and Maya's blood ran cold as she felt the presence of something ancient, something hungry. "What is that?" Ethan asked, his voice wavering as he stumbled backward. The sound grew louder, a low rumble that seemed to come from the very bowels of the earth. The hieroglyphs on the walls began to glow, their symbols twisting and changing before their eyes. A voice, deep, rumbling, and malevolent, spoke from the darkness. "Who dares disturb my slumber?" it boomed, sending chills down their spines. Before they could react, a shadow rose from the sarcophagus. It was a form, tall, dark, and impossibly ancient, its features blurred and indistinct. It moved with terrifying speed, its eyes glowing with an unholy light. The tomb seemed to come alive as the walls twisted and the very ground cracked open beneath their feet. Maya screamed in terror, backing away toward the exit, but the passageway had vanished. The entrance was sealed, the walls shifting as if the tomb itself was trapping them inside. Dr. Carter stood frozen, her eyes wide with obsession. "It's him! It's Marinra!" she whispered, her voice trembling with awe and fear. The figure in the sarcophagus slowly turned toward her, its form becoming clearer. It was no longer just a shadow. It was a creature of darkness, a twisted version of the pharaoh, his skin blackened and withered, his eyes hollow pits of emptiness. The ancient power emanating from him was suffocating, crushing the air from their lungs. "You foolish mortals," the pharaoh's voice echoed. "You have awakened me, and for that, you will pay the price." The tomb began to shift and contort as the curse of Marinra was unleashed. The walls grew alive with shadowy tendrils, reaching out to ensnare the team. Dr. Miller attempted to fight, using a flashlight to strike at the shadow, but the light flickered and died in his hands, plunging him into total darkness. A blood-curdling scream echoed through the chamber before falling silent. Ethan, in blind panic, rushed toward the exit, but the very air in the tomb seemed to congeal, trapping him. The shadows swirled around him, suffocating him with a crushing weight. His body crumpled to the floor, lifeless, as the darkness consumed him. Maya, now alone, her heart pounding, ran to the farthest corner of the chamber. She could hear the pharaoh's whispers growing louder, calling her, beckoning her toward him. The ground shook, and the tomb seemed to close in around her. The shadows reached for her, cold and unyielding, pulling her toward the sarcophagus. She felt her legs give way beneath her, and with one final scream, she was dragged into the darkness. And then silence. The tomb fell still, the curse once again sealed within its stone walls. Outside, the desert winds howled as the last traces of daylight faded into the endless night. The tomb of Pharaoh Marinra, now hidden once more beneath the sand, waited patiently. The curse was never truly broken, only paused, waiting for the next foolish souls to uncover its secrets. Some tombs are meant to stay lost. Some secrets should never be unearthed. Ella had always dreamed of a fresh start, far away from the chaos of the city that had suffocated her for so long. The constant noise, the people, the endless demands. It had all become too much. After months of searching, she found it. A small, secluded house at the edge of a town so quiet it could barely be found on a map. The moment she saw it, she felt something stir inside her, a feeling she couldn't quite explain. The house was old, weathered, with ivy creeping up its stone walls, its windows dark and empty like hollow eyes watching the world pass by. But there was a charm to it, an inviting sense of history, as if it had been waiting for someone like her to step inside. Ella had always believed in second chances. She'd lost so much, her job, her relationships, and needed a place to heal, to rebuild. She had no family left, no real ties to the city. The house was a blank canvas, ready to be filled with new memories. It seemed perfect. As she stood in the doorway, a sense of calm washed over her. The air smelled musty, but there was a strange comfort in it, a sign that the house had been untouched for years. She stepped over the threshold and into the dimly lit hallway, the sound of her footsteps echoing against the creaky wooden floor. The house felt empty. Empty, but not abandoned. It was as though the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for her to settle in. She couldn't help but feel as though the house had been anticipating her arrival, like a long-lost friend eager to reconnect. It was both welcoming and unsettling, a paradox she couldn't quite place. She shook off the thought, trying to push aside the growing unease gnawing at her. It was just the newness of it all, the unfamiliarity. This was her fresh start, after all. Ella set down her first box and moved to the living room, where sunlight streamed through the dusty windows, casting long, soft shadows across the floor. The furniture was sparse, an old armchair, a wooden table, but it had character. Each piece seemed like it belonged, as if it had been waiting for her to return. As she started unpacking, her gaze drifted to the hallway mirror. The glass was old, the frame tarnished, but still beautiful in a worn, vintage way. Ella had never been one to dwell on such things, but there was something about this particular mirror that caught her attention. It wasn't the style or the shape. It was the way it hung on the wall, just a little off-center, like it was trying to pull her attention toward it. She stopped what she was doing and walked over to the mirror, her reflection just a blur in the dim light. As she stared at her own face, something caught her eye in the reflection. A fleeting shadow, tall and indistinct, standing behind her. It was there one moment, gone the next. Her heart skipped a beat. She spun around, half expecting to see someone in the hallway. But there was no one. Ella felt a chill crawl up her spine. She wasn't sure if she was just imagining things, the result of being alone in a new place for the first time in a long while. She took a deep breath, tried to calm her racing heart, and brushed the feeling off. It was probably just the light, she thought. Still, she couldn't shake the image of the shadow from her mind. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ella found herself once again standing in front of the mirror. This time, she felt it, an inexplicable pull. It was like the mirror wasn't just a reflection of her, but something more. She stepped closer, her breath shallow as she watched the glass carefully. And there it was again, the shadow, but clearer now, more distinct. It wasn't just a fleeting blur anymore. It had shape, the outline of a figure, tall and thin, standing behind her with its head lowered. But there was no one in the room. She turned around quickly, her pulse pounding in her throat, but the hallway was empty. Her heart raced as she backed away from the mirror, her legs trembling. Something was wrong. She didn't know why, but the house seemed to be watching her, waiting for something. Ella spent the next few days trying to ignore the feeling of dread that crept into every corner of the house. She unpacked more boxes, tried to make herself feel at home, but the air grew heavier with each passing hour. At night, she could hear faint sounds, creaks in the floorboards, whispers in the walls, the feeling that someone was always just out of sight. Every time she passed the hallway mirror, she couldn't help but glance at it. The shadow was there again, lurking behind her reflection. She could see it more clearly now, tall, gaunt, with empty, dark eyes staring back at her. It didn't move, didn't speak, but its presence was undeniable. Ella tried to convince herself it was nothing, just her imagination playing tricks on her. But then, one night, the shadow stepped forward. Slowly, deliberately. It didn't fade when she turned around. It stayed. In the mirror. It leaned closer, its form shifting like smoke. For the first time, Ella felt real terror. The air around her felt thick, suffocating. Panicked, she ran toward the mirror, grabbing it by the edges and yanking it off the wall. She threw it to the ground, the glass shattering on impact. But even as the pieces lay in a scattered pile, she could feel the presence of the shadow lingering in the room. The whispering started, low and distant at first, but it grew louder. Ella. The voice was faint, almost a breath, but it was unmistakable. It was calling her name. She backed away from the broken mirror, her mind racing. She was no longer alone. The house had been waiting, but now it was hungry. The shadow, the thing in the reflection, was real, and it wanted her. The whispering continued, growing more insistent, as the pieces of the shattered mirror began to shift. Slowly, impossibly, they began to move, aligning themselves together, pulling themselves toward one another. The reflection in the shards began to change, warping, forming a figure, tall, dark, and impossibly familiar. And then, in the eerie silence of the house, a soft, cold voice echoed through the room. "You can't escape me, Ella. You belong to me now." Ella turned to run, but the walls seemed to close in, the shadows thickening around her, trapping her inside the house that had once felt so welcoming. The Haunted Doll, a terrifying legacy. Jessica had spent the last few years trying to escape the shadow of her family's old house, but when her grandmother passed away, she inherited the place. Now, after a long, tiring drive, she found herself back in the same town, standing in front of the crumbling Victorian home she once called home. It had been years since she'd been here, and she hadn't exactly been eager to return. The memories were too heavy. Her grandmother had always spoken of the house with reverence, but Jessica had never felt the same. She remembered the strange coldness in the corners, the way the house felt alive somehow. Still, she couldn't bring herself to sell it, so she decided to move in and start fresh, away from her old life. The first day was spent unpacking, going through boxes of old belongings she barely remembered. She wandered through the rooms, sorting things, but each time she passed the attic door, she hesitated. Something about it made her uneasy. She had never spent much time up there as a child, mostly because it always felt wrong. It was as if something watched her from the shadows. Finally, she could put it off no longer. Taking a deep breath, she climbed up the narrow stairs, the wooden steps creaking under her weight. The attic was as dusty and forgotten as she remembered. Shelves full of old furniture, abandoned toys, and family relics filled the dim space. But one thing caught her eye: an old porcelain doll, placed carefully on a shelf in the far corner. Its glassy eyes seemed to follow her as she approached. Curious, Jessica picked it up. It was beautiful in a way, but unsettling. Its cracked face was frozen in a half-smile, and the lace dress was yellowed with age. She ran her fingers along the edges of its face, the cold porcelain sending a shiver down her spine. "What a creepy thing to keep in the attic," she muttered to herself, trying to laugh off the feeling creeping up her neck. She placed it back down carefully, but as her fingers left the doll, she heard a faint thud behind her. Whipping around, Jessica saw nothing, just the empty attic. But when she turned back toward the doll, it had moved slightly, its head tilted, as if it was looking directly at her. Shaken, Jessica scoffed, trying to rationalize it. Maybe she had bumped the shelf without realizing. "It's just an old house," she muttered under her breath. "Nothing here is real." But something gnawed at the pit of her stomach, and she couldn't shake the sensation that she wasn't alone. The air grew colder around her, and as she turned to leave, she heard a faint sound, like someone whispering her name, soft and distant. It made her freeze. She whipped around again, but the attic was as still and silent as ever. That night, Jessica couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned in bed, the wind howling outside her window and the branches scraping against the glass like fingers. The unsettling feeling of being watched gnawed at her. She pulled the blanket tight around her, but no matter how she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every creak of the house seemed to come from above, from the attic, and soon, the footsteps began. Faint, soft steps, too light to be human, moving slowly across the floor. Jessica lay frozen, too terrified to even move. The footsteps came closer, until they were directly above her bedroom. Then, abruptly, they stopped. The silence stretched, suffocating her. And then, in the stillness, she heard it. An eerie giggle, soft and childlike, but too hollow to be real. It echoed through the attic, bouncing off the walls like it was right behind her. Jessica's heart pounded in her chest, and her mind screamed at her to run, but she stayed frozen, barely breathing. Another giggle, followed by the faint sound of a wooden chair scraping across the floor, slowly, like someone was sitting down. Then, The unmistakable sound of the doll's laughter, quiet at first, then louder and louder, as if it was coming closer. Unable to resist any longer, Jessica bolted out of bed and crept down the hallway. The attic door was ajar, and though the hairs on the back of her neck stood up, she couldn't stop herself. She reached for the door handle, but as soon as her hand touched it, a cold gust of air blasted down from the attic. She yanked her hand away, her heart racing. The giggling stopped suddenly, replaced by an unnatural silence. Jessica opened the door, and the cold air rushed out in waves, making her skin prickle. The attic was darker than she remembered, the shadows stretching unnaturally long. Her flashlight flickered as she stepped inside. Her breath was shallow, her chest tight. She scanned the room quickly, and her eyes landed on the shelf where the doll had been, but it was no longer there. Her heart skipped a beat. She turned, scanning the entire attic, and her flashlight landed on the floor at the center of the room. The doll sat there, staring at her, its eyes now glowing faintly in the dim light. But it wasn't in the same position. It was facing her, sitting up straight, its cracked lips curled into a twisted, malevolent grin. Jessica's body went numb. She staggered backward, tripping over something and crashing to the floor. Her flashlight rolled away from her, the beam flickering over the walls, revealing something she hadn't noticed before. Handprints, small, childlike prints, smeared across the walls, leading up to the doll. "I see you," a whisper echoed, but it wasn't from the doll. It came from behind her, as if someone was standing just inches away. Her breath caught in her throat, but when she turned, there was nothing there. The temperature in the attic dropped further. The air felt thick, suffocating. The doll's eyes followed her every move as the whispers grew louder, more urgent. With a desperate scream, Jessica scrambled to her feet and ran for the door. But as she reached the staircase, she heard the unmistakable sound of tiny footsteps running right behind her. Her heart pounded as she reached for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. She yanked and pulled, but the door was sealed shut, as if some invisible force was pressing against it. Her breath was ragged, and the whispers started again. So close, so suffocating, like 1,000 voices crawling into her ears. Suddenly, she felt something cold on her shoulder. She whipped around, her heart leaping into her throat, but there was nothing there. Her legs shook with fear, and her chest tightened. The doll, it was moving. She could see it now, slowly dragging itself across the floor toward her, its limbs stiff and jerky, like a marionette on invisible strings. Its eyes glowed faintly, and as it dragged closer, the giggling began again. Louder, more frantic, until it was ringing in her skull. "You can't leave," it whispered, and Jessica felt a chill spread through her bones. The voice was no longer just an echo. It was real, inside her head, pulling her into the depths of madness. Panicked, she backed away, desperately trying to find an escape. Her hands trembled as she searched the attic for anything that could help her break free. Her eyes landed on the window. It was her only chance. She sprinted toward it. But before she could even get close, the attic door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang. A cold laugh reverberated from the walls, but it wasn't the doll's this time. It was much darker, more sinister. Jessica turned to face the doll again, but now, it was no longer on the floor. It was standing, tall, almost as if it had grown, its head tilted to the side, its grin widening impossibly. Its porcelain skin cracked, and tiny bits of it fell off, revealing a grotesque, twisted form beneath. The voice wasn't a whisper anymore. It was clear, sharp, and filled with malice. "I've been waiting for you," the doll said in a low, guttural voice, the words feeling like they were clawing at her insides. The cracks on its face spread like spider webs, its eyes now completely black, devoid of any humanity. Jessica could hear a faint humming noise, like a lullaby, and she realized it was coming from the doll's chest. A string, a puppet string. Suddenly, the doll's limbs jerked, and it moved with impossible speed, reaching out with its tiny, clawed hands, grabbing at her legs. Jessica screamed and kicked, but the doll's grip tightened with an unnatural strength, its fingers sinking into her flesh like ice. "No, stop, let go," she cried, frantically pulling away, but the doll's grip only tightened. The humming grew louder, the whispers turned into shrill screams, and the air around her became suffocating, oppressive. It was as if the house itself was alive, feeding off her fear, drawing her closer into its dark heart. She looked up one last time, and in the doll's eyes, she saw something horrifying, an endless, empty void. And within that void, hundreds of faces stared back at her, faces she didn't recognize, all twisted in silent screams, faces of those who had come before her. "Now you're part of the collection," the doll rasped, its mouth moving despite its cracked porcelain face. The attic door slammed open, but Jessica couldn't move. She was trapped, pulled into the doll's grasp, her vision blurred, the light from the attic flickering and dimming until all she could hear was the soft humming of the lullaby. The last thing she felt was cold, empty darkness, then everything went silent. The next morning, the house stood eerily quiet. The attic door creaked open, and the wind whispered through the cracks of the old house. On the floor, in the center of the room, sat the doll, its cracked face smiling once again. But now, it wasn't alone. Around it were several more porcelain dolls, all identical, their eyes glimmering in the darkness. Each one sat in a perfect circle around the doll at the center, and though they remained motionless, their tiny heads seemed to tilt in unison as if waiting for something, someone, to join them. The house was once again silent, but its sinister secret remained. The collection had grown,